welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalugin here with a big episode. Israel has, I guess, retaliated against Iran. We're really seeing some initial strikes, this really small strike we're hearing about, possibly reneging on a strike and going into Rafah from Netanyahu as the Israeli plan forward. There's all sorts of contradicting information from the US media, so we're going to cut through all of that. We have big things going on in Russia as Ukraine appears to be on the verge of collapse. We also, of course, have big situations with Kosovo and the Council of Europe, other situations regarding Trump and the US, and of course some prophecies Father Peter hears going on InfoWars and really spreading the word of the prophecies of St. Paisios, St. Porphyrios, St. Cosmas, of Aitolos, the words of Metropolitan Theophitos, and more. So we're going to talk about all of that. Dmitry, how are you doing in the midst of this third world war we're living through?
I'm doing all right, and it's still quite positive because, again, this conflict hasn't escalated to a third world war just yet, not at least in its hot phase, as we've seen from the strike of Iran against Israel on April 13th. There wasn't an immediate response in the first 24 to 48 hours. And here I was, I believe, on Wednesday, roughly, still awaiting for some sort of response from Israel. And then suddenly I thought, well, perhaps Biden really did scare Netanyahu from taking action. And then suddenly, Thursday, Friday comes around, Israeli strikes. The allegedly missiles hit various targets around Iran, and we have these media sources in the U.S. Of course, the United States very instantly and clearly through through its government department as well as all the mainstream media companies who almost as if a signal was passed instantly state that the US was not involved. This is an Israeli strike against Iran, completely unsolicited. We don't condone this. And the reports from Iran itself actually claim that no significant damage was done. We're not too sure exactly where those bombs, what exactly they struck. Was it spy facilities, weapon facilities, airports? There's almost no information coming out of Iran and Persia, for that matter, for the entire landscape. And we're kind of moving towards actually believing the Iranian officials that this recent retaliatory strike by Israel, and again, of course, this is a tit for tat. So when we call it retaliatory, we have to recognize that Iranian strike on the 13th of April was also in retaliation for the strike of Israel against the embassy. So it is very much a chess game. One player makes the move, the two players, they switch pieces, things like that. And suddenly we're at this point in time where both players have switched pieces. They both took an important political position on this matter, and it seems that neither side has dealt significant damage to the other. And so, was it a missile strike? Was it there were reports, these strange reports of mini drones being flown by Israeli Mossad agents or infiltrators, they were called by the Iranian media, from within Iran itself. And those little drones had explosives attached and they would crash into key Iranian targets. So what exactly the damage was, we still don't have any information about that. But as we know from the Iranian strike against Israel that we discussed in the last episode, the media can be very deceptive. And we know governments of all these various countries do try to cover up these losses locally because, as Israel stated initially, remember, 99.9% of the missiles and drones were shot down. And in fact, it turned out later that, in fact, that wasn't the case. At least two of the airports were significantly damaged, especially their runways, which were struck quite heavily by Iranian long-range missiles. So what is the next step here? Will these countries listen to the wise President Joseph Biden and, really revert any action and not take any more retaliatory strikes against one another? Or, as I think Conrad, you'll propose shortly, perhaps this was a feeler, like an entree type strike, perhaps a scouting strike to see how Iran would react to Israel.
I think that's very likely. And again, you're right, this was a pretty small attack. We were expecting some kind of big response. We're seeing a very purposeful fog of war sort of confusion strategy from the Jewish media in Israel and from even the US media, who again immediately said that they were not part of it. They're clearly trying to signal to Israel that even on the media front, we're not going to side with you when it comes to a potential escalatory response. The US media right now, in the midst of this small attack, is saying, all right, it's over. Israel and Iran have agreed that there's going to be no more escalations. I think that's a bit of wishful thinking from the US, who is hoping to not be dragged into this war with Iran, but we know that's not the Israeli goal in the aftermath of these small missile and drone strikes that, again, some are claiming from inside Iran, others are claiming maybe from inside other neighboring countries, not from Israel itself. We have also seen Israeli strikes on popular mobilization forces in the Babylon region of Iraq recently, and some of these other places. So not just Iran, but the broader Shia crescent and the axis of resistance is under attack by Israel. But what's new, that had already been going on since those Shia militias had united into one force in those areas and started attacking Israel with the Houthis and Hezbollah. So we're just seeing general escalation and in many ways sort of a unity across these groups, Hezbollah, the PMF, Houthis, Iran, they're starting to resemble almost a united army at this point. Of course, they aren't, but the clear coordination and everything is becoming more obvious. But as far as the actual information war, yes, Israel is claiming that, at one point they were claiming they were going to strike hard on Iran. Of course, they're still claiming that they're going to go into Rafah. Netanyahu has claimed that they've solidified a date, like 4 or 5 times now, and then extensive time has passed, and the U.S. has signaled that it will or won't support it and whatnot. And right now, the U.S. is very clearly saying that they are not going to support a Rafah operation. But Itamar ben-Gvir, of course, the most hardcore Kahanist who's in, a position of power at the top of the current Israeli war cabinet, he said that the response, or rather this drone attack, was weak. So in many ways, we could likely expect a bigger, more aggressive attack, or at the very least, as Netanyahu has talked about, foregoing a really large response to the Iranian strikes, but opting instead for the operation onto Rafah, which it would just as likely trigger a response from Iran, as well as equally enrage the rest of the Islamic world, to where if Iran did strike, Saudi Arabia, these other countries that might ostensibly side with Israel would be unlikely to, because even Hezbollah said that they would go in an all-out ground war against Israel if they feel that Rafah in Gaza is truly about to be brought to its knees, and Hamas would be brought to, I guess, total extinction. That's what Nasrallah has said. So I don't foresee Israel actually scaling this thing down. I think they see how far they've been able to go, and we hear about these red heifers supposedly on April 22nd. That is when the Temple Institute wants to do a lot of these things. They don't have all of the details, but many people, I think, going all the way up to the top with Ben-Gvir, they're really all in on this, the eschatological thing, and, dragging the U.S. into war with Iran. And of course, we had Father Peter here as he was on InfoWars, and we've been hearing about the strike on Iran's nuclear program. You talked about, the missiles that supposedly struck. The U.S. was kind of trying to gin up that there actually was an attempted strike on the Iranian nuclear program, I think perhaps to try to get the rest of the Islamic world to condemn Israel and to try to rein Israel in, or other people that have Israel's ear, maybe in Europe, to try to rein them in more. But, the Iranians were very quick to support that their facilities in Isfahan, which is where most of their nuclear capabilities are, completely safe. The flights out of these regional areas were barely interrupted. So the Iranians were very clearly stating that they were kind of trying to pull in Israel when Israel claimed, 99% interceptions. I think they were trying to claim, this did nothing, but at the same time, the attack was much less aggressive than the Iranian attack, which included hundreds of UAVs, hundreds of cruise missiles, and all sorts of other things, as well as coordinated attacks with the axis of resistance. And we are seeing Israel, like I said, strike the axis of resistance right now, but I do believe that either we're going to see this Rafah attack, and that's what Netanyahu has opted to do instead of a true retaliatory, escalatory response, or we're due for something much larger here in the next few days. And what we just saw was probing. So anything could happen, really.
Yeah, and of course, the much larger response will directly involve, as per the prophecies of the recent elders, right? Especially the Greek elders, will involve striking of the nuclear facilities, which is interesting because it seems that Iran, almost as if they know the prophecies themselves, they know that the key targets in Persia and Iran at the moment are those nuclear facilities. Like you mentioned, Iran's commander of security of nuclear facilities actually spoke out, and here's a quote translated into English. He states, if Israel takes action against our nuclear facilities, we'll definitely counter targeting Zionist regime's nuclear facilities with advanced weapons. We've identified its nuclear facilities and have all necessary information of the targets. So Israel does have some key nuclear facilities. Naturally, we've known that Israel has had nuclear weapons for the last at least 30 to 40 years. When remember all those rumors that Iraq also had WMDs and chemical weapons and things like that, those turned out to be false. But Israel, make no mistake about it, Israel definitely has the nuclear capabilities of a country, maybe even similar to Pakistan, if not more than that. So Israel is armed to the teeth, and in fact, probably equally as armed as Iran is, I would say, technologically, as well as thanks to all the funding from the US for the last 60 plus years. So it's really quite curious that Iran knows where, I guess, the pain points are in Israel, and Israel knows where the most sensitive points of Iran is. And I guess the relationship between Joe Biden, his previous place in the Obama administration, and that sort of maneuvering around the Iran nuclear deal, that's all very curious because it plays into this, I guess, this mythology that Biden is this great peacekeeper. He is this, continuer of Obama's work, to sort of consolidate the Iranian regime and sort of bring it back into a peaceful union with the Middle East, which is completely like a false sort of identifiable issue, I think, because we can see clearly that Biden's administration, not only is it very pro-Zionist and pro-Jewish, but also members of his cabinet, his ministers, and those who work in his administration are at least, I would say 30% plus Jewish, if not related, married to, and also, cohabiting with these sort of people. So, in fact, they are quite Zionist. You can't just blame Trump for being the pro Israeli Netanyahu sided person. So, I think the US election has less impact on this conflict than what the reality on the ground. The other thing, of course, is the strikes on Khan Yunis and Rafah, as you stated, Conrad. They continue just actually a few hours before the recording of the show on the 19th of April. 9 people have been killed, literally just an hour ago, in Khan Yunis and Rafah. An Israeli warplane just struck 2 buildings, one in Khan Yunis, one in Rafah. The entire building was demolished, and of course, 6 children were killed and 3 adults in split up between these two sites. And these strikes, of course, are allegedly targeted. They're targeting Hamas underground cells below in the basements, things like that. But when the plane does strike the house, you have bricks, debris, metal, concrete flying everywhere. People are just killed by not just the missile impact, but also from the shrapnel. It's just horrible, right? It's stuff that you read about in like World War II memoirs, but here we are, the Gazans and Palestinians are living it out in real time. And all of this is happening as the Jewish Passover approaches on the 22nd of April, which does bring about some weird correlations with, mass human sacrifice, things like that, and the Talmudic religion itself. And, the fact that this conflict took place and suddenly it's neutralized, Conrad, or at least the media tries to play it as if perhaps this is, the trade has occurred and perhaps it will be neutral. So maybe Jewish Passover can take place in peace, right? Maybe this is the calculation here, that Israel has retaliated and that now they can sort of seek their and fulfill their sort of religious duties, kill these, sacrifice these red heifers, collect their ashes for the future third temple. And there was even a rabbi who's strictly, a rabbi, I would say it's an Israeli politician, but he very much looks like a rabbi, Yitzhak Pindros, who stated very clearly that this Passover sacrifice that will take place either on this weekend or very soon afterwards during the Israeli Passover will usher in the future coming of the Moshiach. Very soon, his arrival, the building of the third temple, and naturally, as all Zionist supremacists, he did state that the Al-Aqsa Mosque would need to be destroyed for the third temple to essentially be placed on its position. Because again, you can't build the third temple near the Al-Aqsa Mosque right next door, because the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Mosque of Omar, it stands right on the position where it's supposed to, where the second temple stood once upon a time, as we read about in the New Testament. So it's all tied in with prophecy, I would say, Orthodox prophecy, and even Jewish eschatological, Talmudic, false clairvoyance, which is granted to them by their demons and all the various other agents who they seek to, gain knowledge and information from. Because it is an info war at the end of the day, and we're kind of playing in it on a human level. So it's very curious. This entire conflict has turned into a game of spycraft. We did mention Mossad last week, right, Conrad? The fact that Mossad, this bloodthirsty NKVD, OGPU, KGB type agency, just assassinates people. Iran knows about this, so I think that with this sort of quiet that's taking place now, Iran is making sure, is probably auditing, filtering all their various government agencies, making sure there are no Israeli agents really literally littered and filtered amongst their own, internal circles. I think that would be incredibly dangerous, especially moving into a full-out war, which will most likely take place soon.
Yeah, we recently saw Erdogan meet with Hamas, actually the leaders of Hamas, Haniyeh, and he talked about how the Israeli regime has surpassed the crimes of Hitler's. So, Erdogan, he really knows how to troll. He knows what to say to, I guess, press the buttons. I've been skeptical of what Erdogan would actually do to support the Palestinians, but it appears, on his way out, as we know the prophecies say, he's going to have to fall and go away before World War III is really going to get underway with Russia and Turkey and perhaps some of these strikes on Iran's nuclear capabilities. But it appears that Erdogan is really, he's really throwing it all in. He's embargoed Israel, so Turkey is no longer going to be importing a lot of Israeli goods. He, of course, is meeting directly with Hamas leadership and is, speaking vociferously against Israel. He's a very large and powerful country, and we hear about, Father Peter talked about this on InfoWars, that ultimately when Erdogan does fall, part of how the Turks are going to close the Bosphorus Straits to then stop the Russians from going to the Middle East to perhaps help Iran and Syria and protect their interests there. Like we know they have that Mediterranean port in Syria. Turkey is going to use the pretext of the war with Greece on the islands to close the straits to prevent the Russians from going through because the Turks will then gain the authority to close the straits. The only way they're allowed to in the treaties now is if they're at war. And of course, there's the perpetual situation with Cyprus and Greece and the militarization of the islands, and of course the 6 mile, 13 mile, nautical EEZ that's been ongoing and has recently been apparently, the pro-Turkish side of it has been endorsed recently by Anthony Blinken. We talked about that in previous episodes. So all of these things ultimately come into play. And even with the Caucasus, we heard even that Israel perhaps was going to be given bases by Azerbaijan to directly strike Iran. And we've even seen the Russian peacekeepers leave Nagorno-Karabakh. So we're going to be talking about all of these sorts of things. But as we await the Rafah invasion, in Israel, we see, Erdogan exerting as much pressure as he can. We see some translations were a bit eager and said that Putin and the Russians said they were going to earnestly stand by Iran. That wasn't exactly what they said. They did, justify Iran's response, and they say they stand with them. And China has said the same thing. And China has also decided that they're going to, opt to go for Palestinian recognition at the UN, which has been ongoing despite the US, vetoing it is becoming more and more popular. So we are waiting for the Rafah operation, which could be what ultimately serves to allow the rest of the Islamic world to turn a blind eye to Iran or Hezbollah or everybody else at once doing what needs to be done. But Dimitri, we talked about Azerbaijan. I'm wondering your thoughts, perhaps. Of course, Russia is leaving, but also on, the potential of them hosting, Iranian strikes, if we want to talk about that as well.
Well, absolutely. I think Azerbaijan has personal interests in northern Iran, of course, the southern coast of the Caspian Sea, as well as those northern Iranians, like, really small valleys, are all, as I suppose, as Azeri populated, or at least there are small groups and tribes of, I guess, ancient Azeri people, which again, this mix of Turkic Persian populations, which Azerbaijan could very much claim, similar to how Ukraine claims the eastern Donbass region as Ukrainian folk, which are currently under the control of Russia. Azerbaijan can do the same with Iran and begin, of course, an operation, or at least contribute perhaps to an Israeli-US strike against Iran in the future. And we have to just give sort of credence to the fact that Azerbaijan does have a military which has been training over the last few years, practicing on Armenia, and of course this sort of battle experience, it goes quite a long way. We see this with the U.S. military, which, say what you will, but the U.S. military is one of the most trained, sort of experienced militaries in the world, because they have been, well, of course you can say unlawfully so, but they have been engaged in Middle Eastern conflicts for the last 3 decades at least, and before that in Vietnam. So even the older generation of officers in the U.S. military and the Navy, they do have experience going back to the Vietnam War. And it's the same, I guess, with Iran to a certain extent. Of course, Iran has never been in a direct war until now with Israel. They've never been in a direct conflict with any of their neighbors since the Iran war, which I think if any listeners want to read up on that war, because you do have to appreciate the Iran-Iraq war was so bloody and so destructive for the region that some of the officers, anybody over the age of 60 who was involved in the military of Iran back in the day, they were all veterans of that war. So they would know how to, maneuver in the region, how to fly planes, where exactly to drop bombs. This was quite an experience for them. And so we see Azerbaijan rising to that occasion. Does the Iranian military have the capacity on the ground, or simply by overwhelming force, to defeat even a small country of Azerbaijan, which has been well trained and probably even well armed? Notice the arming of Azerbaijan continues well into the future. There are no countries sanctioning Azerbaijan. In fact, Azerbaijan is trading with Russia, with the East, with China, Asian countries, and of course the US and NATO. So they're openly in cahoots and in an alliance with the entire world. And we know the Aliyev clan, they're very strong sort of Israeli-Jewish ties with Russian Judeo-Russo, I guess we can say Judeo-Russo oligarchs. So the country is actually in a really good position to be this anti-Iranian force striking from the north whenever the right time comes. And of course, their sort of pro-Zionist position really hasn't been critiqued by the Islamic world, because the Islamic world, for all the Shia sort of religious sectarianism of the Azeris, hasn't really been touched upon by anybody. Everyone's focusing on, say, Jordan, accusing King Abdullah II and his wife Rania, who is, by the way, an ethnic Palestinian. So his wife is literally a Palestinian woman, the Queen of Jordan. Everyone's accusing the Hashemite King Abdullah of betraying the Palestinian people, when in fact, the royal family of Jordan has never really been pro-Palestinian, even going historically back. Like we remember Black October, events like that, which we spoke about on prior months when this conflict just broke out. It's quite curious that there were these accusations thrown at the Sunni rulers, the Sunni Islamic rulers, but Azerbaijan is not really on anybody's radar. When Azerbaijan could be that black swan, that sort of red flag, that burning of the Reichstag type event, which could lead to an insanely large conflict, especially once they finish up and deal with Armenia. And this extraction and exodus of the Russian troops back north, on one hand, yeah, it's curious because Russia could in fact have a very strong impact on the region. They could bring around peace, just like they could have brought peace to the Donbass in 2014, 15, 16, which they didn't. And the Minsk Accords, of course, were completely, I would say, ineffective, as proven by history. The Russians could do the same now in the southern Caucasus, and in fact, probably by soft and even hard power, impact this region and perhaps stop this coming war from taking place if the Russian foreign ministry could, and could kind of somehow convince the Ministry of Defense to kind of work in its interests. Perhaps even, and maybe Vladimir Putin needs to press the red button, but they do need to move and act. On the other hand, Conrad, leaving these, I would say, majority Islamic countries for like I guess the white Russian troops perhaps is a smart idea, because we all know and we all remember what happens to Russians when they're overwhelmed in these positions. Russians don't look Middle Eastern. When the Middle Easterners in some of these countries like Persia, Iran, Azerbaijan, historically even Central Asia, when their bases are overwhelmed by the local populations, enraged by the local extremist mullahs or Mossad agents, Russians don't tend to, live very long, as we saw recently with the Azerbaijani-Armenian conflict, which took the lives of, I think, between 5 and 7 peacekeeping forces. And there's no backlash for it. Aliyev, of course, apologized, but I think the safety of Russian troops perhaps is on the mind of the Russians, or perhaps it's just this laziness, this inability to see that as a regional power, which Russia is, perhaps they do have a responsibility to cater to the local Christians. Yeah, maybe not Orthodox Christians, but Russia does have an effective position to impact some of these southern Caucasus politics. So it'll be interesting to see if Russia completely leaves the region and allows for whatever Zionist plans there are in this region to play out, or will it somehow contribute in a forceful fashion?
Well, we know that Turkey and Azerbaijan have both threatened to invade Armenia proper to secure the Zangezur corridor, connect Azerbaijan proper with the Nakhchivan exclave, thus securing rail and road passage from Baku all the way to Istanbul. So that's all on the table. And the question ultimately for me is, why does Russia and why does Putin, why do these people, I feel like even without reading the prophecies, you should be able to recognize, look, you're allies with Iran. Iran is enemies of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is allied with Turkey. You share this big southern flank with Turkey. Like, why are you boosting to create this kind of continuous Turkish superpower on your southern border while you already have the pretext of protecting an ostensibly Christian minority little country? I just don't understand why you allow this big southern Turkic Muslim flank to be built up when you already have your ally Iran, actively arming Armenia, actively enforcing its territorial disputes with Azerbaijan. And we know that the prophecies talk about war with Russia and Turkey. I mean, even Strelkov knew all about this. So if Strelkov knew all about this, I refuse to believe that not a single other person in Russia could at least even think about it. And I'm sure there's all sorts of strategic realities. I mean, we know that Turkey is where the US wanted to place all of its ICBMs and missiles during the Cold War, because Turkey was the closest within NATO that they could get into the Soviet Union. So Turkey has always been a relevant southern flank when it comes to the US countering Russia on the world stage. But if Turkey, secures this connection with Azerbaijan, and ultimately just totally decimates Armenia, Georgia is already an enemy of Russia, an effective proxy of the West, a candidate for EU membership and NATO influence and all these sorts of things. We're going to talk about the foreign influence, the foreign agent bill there in a second, and the protests going on. But the actual Russian situation, of course, is still ongoing. So, Dimitri, I'm wondering your updates from the Russian front lines and everything. I'm wondering, what the current status of the impending Russian offensive is, because everyone's watching the Middle East, but that's coming.
Yeah, look, the status of the Russian offensive, I think, is still on hold because there are these powers pushing towards peace. I would say within Russia itself, you have the liberal establishment, the fifth column, which we spoke about, which keeps sabotaging Russia's efforts, putting good people in prison, pushing Russia, I guess, culturally speaking, in a bad direction. On the other hand, you do have the oligarchs, the businessmen who this war really has impacted their income and even some of their savings and holdings. They've been personally sanctioned. They don't want to be sanctioned. They want to travel to Italy. They have real estate in London. Like, if you look at like most expensive villas in Italy and London, a lot of them are owned by Russo-Jewish oligarchs and bankers who actually live in Moscow right now who are under sanctions. So it's not like only the base people are under sanctions. Like half of those people, I would say, very not right wing at all. In fact, I would even question their, say, Orthodox Christianity, perhaps. So if you look at that list of sanctioned individuals within Russia itself, it's really not the most outstanding people. So these people are vowing for peace. They actually want a peace between Russia and Ukraine. Perhaps they're even willing to give certain oblasts away. But the Russian offensive is coming. We know the conscription has been solidified, so there are young people training in the back. The only thing I think holding back a proper Russian push towards maybe securing the rest of, say, maybe even taking a city like Kharkov or pushing into the Kharkov Oblast and taking the rest of the Donetsk Oblast, especially after the fall of Avdiivka, would be that lack of mobilization, right? We are waiting, and I think this will be the first sign of a Russian offensive taking place, is a secondary mobilization wave. Because right now, Russia has, at least officially, as Putin stated, the numbers of the forces on the front lines are 660, 680,000 servicemen. And this is not everybody that is armed with a machine gun. Some people, of course, working in logistics as staffers, helping the military in general, but it's roughly around 600,000 mark. Now, they would need a second mobilization in order to secure such a large 100-kilometer front line here. And everybody has spoken about it. Strelkov has mentioned it, Maxim Kalashnikov, all these various Russian political spokespersons, even people like Maxim Shevchenko, who has over 1 million subs, and he's a Marxist and he's anti-war, but even he's mentioned that until the second mobilization is announced, they're probably at least an effective offensive that can push the Ukrainians back like quite solidly and have that secured second line would probably be unlikely, because you do need soldiers to sort of hold a new front line, which you will push out. So I think that's essentially what we're waiting for. That's the cue. But at the moment, Russia's doing quite well, I think, pushing back all these various villages on almost every front line. And against Kharkov is the main target. We've spoken about it for a few weeks now, but Russia is securing itself in that Lugansk Oblast. We have seen, reports from the front lines. It's actually, the morale is quite high. We saw a good friend of ours, the Russian Orthodox journalist from Spas TV and Sidegrad TV, Andrei Afanasyev, who we will actually have on the show very shortly. We're in communication with him. So he was there with Gabriel the Russian on the front lines of Avdiivka with Gabriel's, I guess, his commandos from his particular volunteer division. And they were driving around filming videos, posting them on Telegram. And that's quite... lifts the morale very much for especially us following the conflict from outside of the SMO zone, as well as probably the troops within the SMO zone who have mobile phones. And, they sit in the trenches, they watch videos to have internet connection, and they need to see this sort of uplifting spirit. So in general, the Russian front line, despite the lack of news, has been quite solid. We've seen a solidification. Ukrainians have stopped advancing completely. So that entire Ukrainian offensive, which took place in the middle of last year, has been halted. In fact, they've lost territory at this point. So the Russians have made gains. And the last 10 to 12 months has been overall a big success. Now, Russia's next step, right, is a mobilization, and essentially is to make up for those losses of September 2022, when around the time General Surovikin came to power. Surovikin, by the way, we haven't heard anything about him. He has completely gone off the radar. His wife, who, she's a really wealthy Jewish woman from Moscow, she's also not appeared in any of the media sites. We're not sure what's happening with Surovikin. For all we know, he's acting somewhere in North Africa, or perhaps working in the Russian military diplomacy region, perhaps trading, working with military arms trading. Officially, of course, this is through official exportation of Russian goods to various countries in Africa, which is siding with Russia. Maybe he's working with Wagner, but not in any supreme commander type position, which he had before. So I think generally that's the overcast at the moment. But again, it's interesting, and it'll be interesting and intriguing to see, Conrad, whether or not Russia, even without a mobilization, if it begins to push really deeply towards June, July of this year, especially when the summer kind of solidifies the territory. There's no more mud, there's no more snow, the rains kind of die down. It's just perfect. You can move these tanks along the dirt roads, you can move them along the fields, especially if there's no minefields, right? It's quite clear skies, it's not cloudy and quite warm, so it's almost the perfect weather and atmosphere to sort of push your forces forward. I mean, this is historically how ancient armies have moved through this territory anyway, so it all makes sense.
I mean, that's when Ukraine made all of their successful gains that first summer, but we've heard Lavrov talk about May 20th, May 21st, after supposedly Zelensky will have exceeded his legitimacy, he will have canceled elections, he will be, ruling beyond his mandate, as it were. So perhaps on those dates we'll hear maybe mobilization announcement. Maybe the goal will be to have the Ukrainian people see how many people and how many weapons and how powerful the Russian military can be with mobilization, to the point where they just overthrow Zelensky, force him to come to the negotiating table, I could see all sorts of ways that the mobilization itself is used as a propaganda and soft power tool against the increasingly chaotic regime. I've heard reports of all sorts of different right wing groups. I think McGregor has talked about different elements of Reich Sector or Adar or Azov Battalion now refusing to fight and mobilize for Zelensky. So we're, I think, slowly going to start seeing the end of this whole Ukrainian experiment finally come before us. But we're seeing less and less strikes on Crimea, but we are seeing still some strikes on Belgorod, Bryansk, and even on the outskirts of Moscow with some of these drone attacks and everything, which, we saw all the drone attacks from Iran. It was finally the first time actually seeing these Shaheds and these other UAVs in action outside of Ukraine, but they're still being used very much. The Turkish drones on the Ukrainian side and the Iranian drones on the Russian side. But it seems that that is exactly the nature of warfare that we're seeing right now. We saw the United States do the first AI dogfight. So we're really getting a glimpse of, fifth generation warfare, of, the 21st century, what World War III, what pitched battle may or may not look like. Like I said, it was a real human pilot against a jet that was piloted by artificial intelligence. So we're just going to have insanely advanced, AI operated drones just combing the skies. It's like something out of Black Mirror or The Matrix or something. You try to go do something and you'll just get totally strafed and struck down by some AI drones going above you. But I guess that's the future we live in right now. The future is here as far as warfare is concerned. But yeah, Ukraine, we see the Russians pushing in Avdiivka direction. We see them pushing towards Kharkov, obviously, in the Orikov direction, down in the south. And of course, there's still a situation on Kherson with the Dnieper. We haven't seen any work to advance towards Kherson city yet, but perhaps that will come with mobilization. But unless you have anything else to say on Ukraine, Dimitri, we can talk about actually this Kosovo situation. We saw Kosovo trying to enter the Council of Europe. Of course, we saw Cyprus, Hungary, Spain, and a few others on the Council of Europe be against Kosovo's accession, but unfortunately they were outnumbered. It passed 131 to 29. So Kosovo now in the Council of Europe, despite multiple members of the Council of Europe not even recognizing the existence of Kosovo. It literally said, the resolution read, member states, irrespective of the position they may express in relation to Kosovo's membership application, must respect the decision made and collaborate sincerely and effectively in its implementation, which is just, it's like, yeah, you don't recognize Kosovo and we're not going to be mad about it, but just cope and, put up with them on this council, which is de facto recognizing them. So we're seeing, escalation against Serbia in the Balkans, of course, Kosovo moving towards membership. And it's a similar situation with Georgia, who, has similar territorial disputes with Abkhazia and South Ossetia that in theory should, exclude them from being members in NATO or some of these European organizations. But nonetheless, we saw the supposed signature of Patriarch Ilya, which I'm skeptical of, claiming to support accession into the European Union. And now in Georgia, we're seeing these huge protests against the Georgian Dream endorsed, anti-foreign agent bill, which would really be sort of an anti-Soros, anti-Western NGO bill. So, Dimitri, I'm wondering your thoughts on the Balkan situation as well as this Georgian bill and the protests.
I think it's quite curious because the anti-foreign agent bill could be used as a double-edged sword, right? On one hand, we do know that there are Western agents like the various Soros foundations and all kinds of Western funded NGOs which function in Georgia and former Soviet CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States countries, which of course endorse anti-Russian attitudes and anti-Soviet, anti-Russian imperial. I would say openly anti-Orthodox because they're against the Orthodox Church's unity, I guess, cross-jurisdictionally in a communal, synodal sense, global university, and even I would say for its Catholicity, right? So this sort of universal Orthodox Church union, this is what the Soros foundations work against. But the double-edged sword factor, right, returning to that, they could also, again, this bill could potentially strike against so-called Russian influence if Georgia, again, falls more towards the left and waist side. But we do see that the leftists in Georgia really they're quite upset at the bill. We're not sure what these protests are exactly about or who's funding them. We don't have really data on the ground, but the protests are quite varied. And we have spoken about the fact that any colored revolutions in former Soviet countries should be initially placed under suspicion. We did see the Maidan revolution. Initially, they were framed as anti-corruption, right? They stated that, well, he doesn't want to be ordered to the president as corrupt, even though they voted for him, by the way. And then, of course, the entire movement was either co-opted, or it was revealed that the entire protest system in Ukraine was funded from abroad, run by the CIA, run by Victoria Nuland, etc. So I would be incredibly suspicious of any protests in former Soviet countries, just to begin with. But in Kyrgyzia as well, so this is a country, a neighboring, a very small mountainous country, neighboring Tajikistan, also passed an foreign agents bill, very similar to Russia, which passed one last year. And actually, the Russian bill actually was found quite effective. They banned a lot of liberal fifth column type channels on YouTube. Various other platforms had to be shut down, or their offices had to be moved from Russia into Western Europe or countries like Finland and Scandinavian countries, because they couldn't essentially spread fake news within Russia itself. So Russia per se does not have free speech, and we knew that for a long time. But this anti-free speech legislation essentially targets mostly misinformation aimed at the military, Russian Orthodox culture, I would say, and even essentially it strikes to, this media presence from Western foundations. They strike to destabilize the country and essentially bring the nation to revolution, which is what these foundations, or I guess their predecessors, did in 1905 and 1917 in the Russian Empire. Like, we know that very clearly. The lack of media control was one of the main downsides of the late Russian imperial government, because they couldn't control the newspapers, they couldn't control the various propaganda machines which worked within the actual empire itself. There was complete freedom of speech, which is insane if you consider it like in today's context. Like, that would be like Russia would literally have fake news all over everywhere, speaking about the SMO, how the Russian Orthodox Church is satanic, things like that, which YouTube channels do today. Like, we saw Maxim Katz, the Jewish Russian big YouTuber, has millions of subs, literally call the Russian Orthodox Church a church which is demonic, right, in his channel. Like, that sort of blasphemous, sacrilegious rhetoric would not be allowed in Russia. But Maxim Katz does not live in Russia anymore because, well, there's a warrant out for his arrest because he's a foreign agent. So that's a positive sign of how this foreign agent bill could work. I'm quite a little bit skeptical towards the fact that, well, Georgia is still, we don't know, right? Georgia's still on this sort of swing. It's going left and right. It hasn't really fallen onto either the pro-Russian, super hyper-Orthodox side, nor has it fallen onto the EU side. So we're still kind of looking out. And it is concerning because Patriarch Ilya, he's probably the most respected hierarch in the Orthodox Church. They are one of the most respected hierarchs, but he's getting quite up there in age. And his sort of conservative positions, will they be supported by the next hierarch who comes to his position to take that seat as the Patriarch of Georgia? I think that's going to play a major role in that country's culture, I would say, moving forward. So some real concerns there. Regarding Kosovo, this is incredibly hypocritical. On one hand, you have European countries, Central Western European countries, which helped essentially create Israel in the middle of the 20th century, and at least supported Israel, its creation, literally out of nowhere, right? Based on these Zionist fantasies. On the other hand, now that the Palestinian people, after 70 years of oppression, want to actually have a state and want to have at least some recognition, they're being denied that by these same European countries who opted to at least give a voice to this neutral, weird amalgamation. I would say the Kosovo is not just a fake country. It's almost like a mockery of what the Palestinians want to create in Palestine proper today. It's like the Palestinians are an actual branch of the Semitic Arabic peoples. Like, perhaps they are also related to the ancient Philistines we read about in the Old Testament. They're an actual people. Who are the people of Kosovo? It's a mix between Serbians who still live there and who weren't just genocided over the decades, and a mix of Albanian immigrants, right? Like, these are the Kosovars. Yeah, like, this is a completely artificial state. And even the shape of it's just like a round circle, right? It makes completely no geographic sense. The country has no local economy, has no culture. It's an artificial cutout, right? And not just that, but it's also, I would say, an example of how the Orthodox Christians could approach this new question of, which is brought up by a lot of the far right-wing circles in media, this question of the great replacement, right? This, it comes up all the time. So it's so-called the theory of white supremacy, that white people are being replaced by immigrants and illegal immigration, and that's how the white Europeans will be genocided over time. Well, how we Orthodox Christians can approach that is, well, we take a view of Kosovo, for example. This is an example of how Orthodox Christian white people, Serbians in this case, were genocided over time by an influx and essentially a forced migration of Muslims who oppressed them over the decades and led to their essential almost extinction in a once Christian land. So I think it's like a snapshot exactly of a particular strategy, a tactic, that could be used by the globalists in the future. Like if you say this theory of the Kalergi plan and the Great Replacement, it doesn't work, and essentially it's built up by pagans and neo-Nazis, I would only point you towards the example of Kosovo as a counter argument. This is a snapshot of what will take place in all over Europe, and I would say Orthodox countries specifically. And Georgians should pay attention because Georgia is surrounded by some of the strangest culturally speaking peoples, not just north towards Dagestan, Chechnya, but also south, towards Azerbaijan. And man, there's some strange populations living there. So Georgians should really pay attention because they also claim to be Europeans, despite the fact that they live in the Caucasus and they're very much, Middle Eastern looking. So it's very the entire Kosovo situation is one which we will follow and we will of course watch throughout the coming weeks, and its development will lead us towards further revelations about, I guess, the future of Europe and geopolitics in the Balkans in general.
Yeah, you talked about the foreign agent bill in Kyrgyzstan. George Soros was forced to, pull his entire operation out of Kyrgyzstan after the foreign agent law passed. And you talk about Georgia, using this against Russian organizations. I don't know any Russian organizations that are still even operating in Georgia. I think they all got driven out. I met some Georgian people in Russia, that used to work in Russia and be more on the Russian end of things, and all those people ended up just moving to Russia or moving to Belarus or moving elsewhere because, even the Georgian Dream Party, which are behind this bill, they're being called Russian nationalists. They're not Russian nationalists. They're truly just Georgian nationalists, and they're pro the Georgian Orthodox Church. And the Georgian Orthodox Church is the only avenue with which diplomatic relations even exist between Russia and Georgia. Besides that, they're totally severed over the Abkhazia, South Ossetia issues. But this foreign agent bill, it's been pledged to be vetoed by the female president, who's super cringe, Salom Zurabishvili, but it won't matter because the Georgian Dream Party has a massive majority. They've got 150 seats in the Georgian parliament, so they'll be able to quickly overrule the veto and the law will be able to go into effect. But again, Georgia, obviously it's unfortunate that they're as anti-Russian as they are, but I think they're somewhat getting hip to the fact that, the rainbow imperialism of the West is much worse than any perceived Russian yoke that they may or may not supposedly be under if they, went in the more Russian sphere of influence direction. And of course, we know Patriarch Ilya, in many ways a living saint. I'm sure he will pass away fairly soon as he is quite old, but I mean, he alone can be credited with boosting the birth rates in Georgia. All the other Caucasian countries and Eastern European countries, the birth rates are down, but Georgia, their over replacement rate, thanks to Patriarch Ilya, baptizing every third child of Georgians for the past 2 decades or so, and really starting a Georgian baby boom. And of course, that's very Orthodox, and the Orthodox Church has been the main, avenue of all of that. So we pray for him, and we hope the Georgian people can continue to resist globo homo, which I do think this law will help them do. And every year the pride nonsense comes around, and I think that just hardens the resolve of the Georgian Christians and the Georgian people. But yeah, the Kosovo stuff, we're watching Dodik and his actions closely. Obviously, I'm sure he's working and talking with Vucic. Him and Vucic were talking about their mutual love for the Hungarians. So Vucic and Dodik have very much been on the same page. So I'm sure they're coordinating on the Kosovo issue and coordinating Srpska's responses to the Bosnia situation accordingly. So one of the fronts we're always watching, of course, you guys all know that, but it appears that Romania, I know Hungary, of course, sided with Serbia, and of course Cyprus did, but besides that, it looks like Greece and Romania, unless the map I was looking at was wrong, ultimately either didn't vote or supported Kosovo entering into the Council of Europe. Don't fact check me on that, but the only ones I'm sure of were Cyprus and Hungary and Spain. So, perhaps some Orthodox betrayal there. Greece has not been impressing us recently, but I think maybe as some of these prophecies get fulfilled, we might see some dramatic reversals of direction from Greece. But with all of that, Dimitri, we've got to talk about some of these big interviews that have been going on. We've got Tucker Carlson he's going on Joe Rogan, of course, talking about UFOs. He's talking to Pavel Durov, the founder of Telegram. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this broader information war. Of course, with the UFO stuff, Tucker, I was always suspicious of how much he was bringing this UFO stuff to light on Fox News because he was kind of talking about it from a normie way. But he's clearly saying that the deception is that they're from Mars or something. He's saying it's a supernatural phenomena and that, they're demonic in some capacities. So that's good. Of course, Tucker should move on from Episcopalianism and become Orthodox, but he's a newsman. I don't know how serious he thinks about all those sorts of things, but he stood up for the UOC. We appreciate that. But obviously, you're going to go on Joe Rogan. You're going to probably smoke a little pot and talk about UFOs. So that appears to be what happened. But yeah, I mean, obviously, we're big fans of Father Seraphim Rose. Everyone should read Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future. Father Spiridon Bailey has his The UFO Deception follow up. I've been pretty invested in the UFO situation as it also kind of overlaps with cosmology, which you all know I'm quite interested in, which hopefully we'll have some more episodes on in the nearish future. But Dmitry, what are your thoughts on that as well as the Pavel Durov Telegram interview? Because, the show wouldn't really be possible without telegrams. So we'll put that out there first as well. It's an invaluable tool. At World War Now Telly, be sure to follow us there, of course.
No, absolutely. I think, look, firstly, about the interview of Joe Rogan and Tucker, I think that the mentioning of the fact that UFOs, these appearances of strange creatures and things like that in the skies, they, attributing it to spiritual phenomenon as a supernatural occurrence, I think is very, very important because it kind of moves. Again, I know it's a cliche, but we use this term all the time because it really simplifies the concept for a lot of people. The Overton window shifts a little bit because that is in fact a reality. We read this in the lives of saints when sorcerers and all these various wizards and warlocks and witches, of course, when they sacrifice people, they usually call upon ghosts, demons, or even sacrifice animals, things like that, to come up and appear almost, as if from a different dimension, appear in the real time, real space, and perform some sort of miracles, healings, and sometimes even, of course, as we know from the canons of the church and the laws of the Byzantine Empire, where, they would hex people and cause curses to take place in real time. So I think UFOs and these sightings of really malicious things in the skies, weird things, were just like in the medieval times where people would see witches flying through the air at night during Walpurgis night or something like that. This is like a real phenomenon which people should take into account. And it isn't about aliens; it's about what we have existing on Earth at the moment, which is a real sort of obsession with occultism. And real occultism, I would say, sometimes in the form of Talmudic Judaism and other times in a more pagan sense. This is why paganism is essentially dangerous, and especially it should be not taken very lightly. And in fact, I don't think like paganism can be seen as a movement which we ally ourselves closely with, because real paganism always involves sacrifice. There's no such thing as paganism without sacrificing something. Sometimes it's physical goods, other times it's lives. And this is why, of course, we really can't look towards a long-term friendship with those sort of groups and people. I think that's what all Orthodox Christians and Christians in general need to take into consideration. But Pavel Durov, a very curious interview with Tucker Carlson. It's an intriguing character because he's 39, turning 40 this year. Very sort of well-dressed, handsome guy. Really, there's some photos of him working out. The guy's really fit. He's had a bit of a glow-up, similar to, I would say, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, who, he was balding at a young age, and suddenly his hair grew back. He's had, I would probably say, like a bit of like some touch-ups, some plastic surgery. He looks a lot more handsome than he did when he was younger. And of course, he's a billionaire. So, right, he was on the 100 Forbes list for one of the youngest billionaires on there. But he's an interesting character because not only does he have this weird artificial look where he's made no mistakes in the past, there's almost no interviews with him. And this is the first major interview of Pavel Durov. But even the interview itself, it's a bit where it's kind of very technical. He's a bit cold. And it's almost, he comes off as a really smart person, but also somebody who really doesn't want to reveal what's happening probably behind the scenes. Now, one of the conspiracies about him, and of course we do cover conspiracies on the show, so let's voice this particular opinion, that Pavel Durov, his father, was at least in some way aligned with the KGB, perhaps a KGB informant, or perhaps even an outright agent, similar to like an Indiana Jones type figure. He was a university professor, like he would give lectures in Italy, actually, where Pavel Durov himself grew up. And Italy, if you think about it, compared to the USSR, it was quite a prestigious place. Italy had its own Hollywood, Hollywood on the Tiber. Italy had its famous, luxury brands, its Ferraris, its Porsches, Lamborghinis, things like that. Italy was a nice place to grow up. And who would have a privilege of living in Italy as a young man, especially in like, which Russian would have the privilege of traveling to Italy and growing up there? Only somebody who has really close ties with the agencies which run, spy and world affairs, of course, from the USSR itself. There are other conspiracies that, well, this KGB connection transferred onto young Pavel, who, when him and his brother Nikolai developed Vkontakte, that famous Russian alternative of Facebook, when that inheritance transferred over the two younger sons of Valery Durov, they of course worked together with the FSB to create not just Kontakte but also Telegram. And Kontakte turned out to be this Russian alternative of Facebook, which never really blew up. And we all know historically Mark Zuckerberg, that Jewish entrepreneur from Western United States. He did work with Palantir and some of these other CIA slash FBI aligned companies in the US when he did develop Facebook. So we know very clearly, and I think most of us who even use Facebook and Facebook Messenger, we know that we're being spied on directly. Like we don't say things which could sign us onto certain watch lists, things like that in these messenger sites, especially because we know that the CIA and the FBI have a skeleton key backdoor access to these websites and chat rooms. Now, the question arises, does Pavel Durov have some connection to the FSB? And if he does, would you mind using Telegram and allowing the FSB to have some sort of, backroom access to your chat rooms and vlogs? I would say I wouldn't mind as much, frankly. If Pavel Durov does have some connection to the FSB, Russian contemporary agency and inheritor of the KGB archives and things like that, then I think that's probably the sacrifice we need to make for information security, Conrad, as well as I guess the reality is that there really aren't any other apps or websites which we can use in a secure type fashion to promote some of our views. So that's kind of the two conspiracies about Durov. The other one is, of course, one alleging that he's perhaps of Jewish descent based on his physiognomy, his eyes, his nose, his ears. But I'm not a real physiognomy expert. I haven't really studied the arts of the genetic makeup of peoples or how they look, or specifically, I'm not a Leonardo da Vinci type guy. I'm not a good artist either. So Pavel Durov, I'm just going to go down to the theory that let's just say he's a Slavic Russian. He did say at one point that his mother came from a family which originated from Ukraine and Kiev, and we know Kiev was in the Pale of Settlement back in the day. But that's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to go anywhere there. It's similar because Navalny's mother's side was also from near Chernobyl as well, which was in the Pale Settlement. But that's, I think, a conspiracy I'm not willing to touch at the moment, especially without any further research. But Durov, his connection to the FSB, could it be similar to Zuckerberg's connection to the FBI and CIA? Potential. I think there's a potential there. Durov claims to be a libertarian. He lives in Canada or various countries, the UAE. He travels all abroad. He really is a cosmopolitan type businessman, a billionaire. He has the money to live essentially anywhere. He claims to have no connection to the Russian government. But still, I think he's a key player. And the fact that he's so much in the shadows, Conrad, does perhaps raise some suspicions. Like maybe he is just the mind behind the machine in terms of like he does all the work, but perhaps the person behind the wheel is somebody else. Maybe the FSB, maybe it is President literally Vladimir Putin running Telegram, which in that case I'll be sure to use it even more. Like I know this is a little bit of a Western conspiracy, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so Durov, I mean, he was recently given UAE citizenship, which they don't just give to everybody in those Gulf states. Most people are non-citizen, Indian, Filipino migrant workers, kind of like slaves or something. But, Durov, I'm sure he lives in some very nice Dubai, high rise and was granted citizenship. I'm sure the Emiratis, they'd love to be involved in some of the behind the scenes situations on Telegram. Yeah, I'm sure the Russian government probably has some level of access because a lot of things are banned in Russia, but Telegram is not. So I'm sure they trust it more than they do others in some capacity, especially considering, how many things have been kind of given up on both sides as far as OSINT and information war regarding people and frontline people posting things on Telegram. So it's a very interesting and relevant platform, and I think it's one of the key pillars in the information war, how quickly certain information can be spread and proliferated from the front lines of these conflicts and then so easily translated into other languages. It's really quite the magnificent tool for all of those sorts of things. But moving on from that, we got to talk about some of this church persecution stuff in Ukraine as the front line is collapsing. It's crazy how we still see the church persecutions ramping up. I can only assume it's because the state really is trying to dismantle any kind of apparatus that would work in any kind of productive way with the Russians or a future Russian administration. And again, that's not to say the UOC is quote unquote pro-Russian. It's just, the church isn't a revolutionary body. They're going to work with whoever's in power at the time. So I think they would rather have every aspect of Ukrainian society, I guess, including the church, be basically revolutionary in mindset. So if there's an occupation, they can wage a, low-level insurgency and be resisting at all levels, which is just a really unfortunate, byproduct of U.S. influence. We see Trump not endorsing this big bill that's going to give billions to Ukraine, billions to Israel, and then, less than 10% of it's going to Taiwan, China stuff. Mike Johnson is in favor of this. despite the fact that he, in theory, at the beginning of his speakership was against Ukraine aid and all of that stuff. But, we got to get this Israel aid through that we all know is bipartisan. So that's all got to go through, and they're trying to get Ukraine going through. Suddenly, Mike Johnson is coming out and saying that Russia, Iran, and China are the new axis of evil and all these sorts of things. So we're getting the new Cold War rhetoric. I guess Johnson got brought into the back room and explained what's really going on here and perhaps, shown some tapes or whatever. But we're seeing Trump come out against it, which is good to see. Of course, Trump, he makes very vague claims on Israel and Ukraine these days because knows how contentious it is. In some ways, I am glad that Trump is not in power because he may have just already started hitting Iran or any of these other things. But Dimitri, when it comes to the other situations in Ukraine regarding, the church persecutions and whatnot, I'm wondering, do you have any updates? We still see the Rada moving forward or attempting to move forward with the legislation to ban the church entirely. And we also see Estonia, they kind of had to walk back some of their rhetoric. They said that, the church is no longer a terrorist group, but they're still trying to pass legislation to ban it. So the canonical church, ostensibly under the Moscow Patriarchate, whether it's in Ukraine or other areas of the Russosphere, is very much under threat.
Yeah, of course. While we wage the info war here online, through this podcast as well as some of the posts we make on Telegram and Twitter X, there is a spiritual war happening on the ground in Ukraine and live, real time, not just in Palestine, but in Europe, in one of the heartlands of the Orthodox Church at the moment. And yeah, some of the stories, like this is literally a story from a day ago, happened in the village of Ladizhna. So, in the village of Ladizhna, an Orthodox Christian church, which still commemorates the Patriarch of Russia, Kirill, actually. So, they still pray for the Patriarch during their liturgies. It's the only church in this entire village that still does that. It was raided this Friday morning before the liturgy by a group of, it seems like young men, most probably Ukrainian radicals, perhaps hired by the police. These are not people with badges. These are literally, they appear to be hooligans, but even though police was called, no police arrived at the scene, and 10 to 15 people actually were dressed in black. A lot of them had face masks, not COVID masks, like balaclavas. A lot of the balaclavas had weird demonic symbols on them as well, like, maybe like punk rock star inspired, but still, can you imagine these sort of people wearing these like black vests, things like that, raiding the church? I mean, it's just horrible, right? And all the babushki who arrived to, most people only go to church twice a week, so you'd have the really pious folk, the old folk there for the Friday morning liturgy, and suddenly these people in black just raid the church, break into the altar, kick everybody out, and start doing something in the altar. Who knows what kind of desecration is taking place? But there's footage of the attack, which we'll be posting on our Telegram and on our X page of World War Now. So it's just quite horrible. And this is the church of the Kazan icon of the Theotokos. So that's just one story, and this, of course, takes place almost every single week. These raids, priests getting taken away, things like that. And this is the biggest story moving on, and I guess big story in terms of the cultural impact and Ukraine sort of moving towards this Khazaria type institution, which is trying to build, is the petition of Ukrainian liberals, which is now being passed through the Kiev local sort of state parliament, right? I mean, not state, but like the Kiev local city parliament, is the removal of the giant Archangel Michael statue, a monument to the holy Archangel Michael who defeated Satan a long time ago before Adam and Eve. His statue stands on Maidan Square, the so-called Maidan Square of Kiev today, and the Ukrainians want it removed. And why? Because they claim Archangel Michael is the defender of the Russian armed forces, and he's a symbol of Russian Orthodoxy. Okay, so you're trying to remove a statue of an archangel because you claim that he protects your enemies? I mean, then who do you align yourself with exactly? The forces of Satan, perhaps? I'm not sure. Well, we know them by their fruits. And amidst all of these persecutions and anti-cultural campaigns, the support of LGBTQ divisions, which, by the way, are being expanded upon, we see Ukraine trying to remove this Archangel Michael statue, this monument to, this great sort of hero of Christian culture. I mean, an archangel, right? So quite curious. And of course, the Archangel statue was put up during the reign of Catherine the Great in 1782 when Kiev was, essentially reconstituted under the Russian protection, because Kiev was very greatly destroyed in 1240 when the Mongols raided it, and the siege was so heavy that Kiev essentially needed to be rebuilt anew, which the Russian Empire did. It reinvested so much money and funds into it. And this statue kind of symbolized Kiev's return to its former glory historically. Now, the interesting, like, cultural side of things, we mentioned the LGBTQ division. Their official name is the LGBTQ Host. So there are several hundred gay, trans, lesbian Ukrainian soldiers. I know it sounds like a caricature. It isn't. 53 French nationals and former veterans of the French armed forces who belong to the LGBTQ plus have officially traveled to Ukraine and have enlisted in this LGBTQ battalion called the Warriors, the Gay Warriors, or the LGBTQ Host. And their symbol, as we've probably seen before, like I think it was a few years ago when this was published in early 2022, that Ukraine was forming this gay battalion of sorts. So not just the Zolvan Black Sun, we also have the Rainbow Battalion with their own unicorn symbol. I know this is, I mean, we all love unicorns, and unicorn is a sign of European, you know, it's a sign of virginity in like European symbology. It's a sign of purity. These people have polluted even the beautiful unicorn sign as well. And in fact, that's the symbol. So 53 French men, and perhaps this is what Macron was speaking about, Conrad. This support for Ukraine will come with the literal influxion of, I don't know, HIV positive type people into the Ukrainian armed forces who will now be fighting against the Russian Orthodoxy on the front lines. I mean, this is just as demonic as it can get, I think, and we're seeing it sort of raised to the next level. The other small bit of church news, which I think most of you will find quite amusing, especially if you do know this particular person, former deacon of the Russian Orthodox Church, Father Andrei Kurayev, was reinstated into his deaconhood again, but not by the Russian Orthodox Church, which defrocked him and excommunicated him for essentially speaking down to other priests, using profanity, and calling the Russian Orthodox Church a harlot, which he did officially, which again is blasphemous and sacrilegious. He did a lot of bad things, right, including not listening to his bishop, which had him defrocked. But he moved to Hungary, and now he's been reinstated into his deaconhood by none other than Patriarch Bartholomew himself. So Patriarch Bartholomew has used his alleged appeal rights as the ecumenical patriarch to reinstate and sort of undefrock and bring back Andrei Kurayev. So now Andrei Kurayev, even though he doesn't serve in any church, he's officially a deacon again, allegedly, according to Patriarch Bartholomew. Now, this is an abuse again of the ecumenical patriarch's role, because we know that these, the appeal rights do exist in reality, but these appeal rights are only used if a proper motion and an application is brought to the ecumenical patriarch, and he also needs to listen to the other side. So the respondents in this particular matter would be the Russian Orthodox Church. He would need to listen to their reasons as to why they defrocked Kurayev in the first place. But the Patriarch Bartholomew didn't listen to the Russian Church. He didn't look at the case. He just simply undid officially, or at least attempted to visually, symbolically undid the defrocking of Andrei Kurayev. And you may ask, well, why is Andrei Kurayev important? He's probably the most famous deacon in the world at the moment in the Orthodox Church. Yes, mostly I'm not even sure if he speaks English, but his Russian audience is enormous. His live journal audience is still very big. His presence on YouTube gets hundreds and thousands of views. And unfortunately, he does make a lot of very scandalous and liberal statements, which he does specifically for PR purposes, for media purposes, and to gain views. And that's just probably the most amusing story of the week in terms of church ecclesiastical politics, because we see this character being brought back up after a 2-year hiatus since, I would say, the COVID pandemic. And remember, he was very famous for calling the COVID pandemic, for those who opposed the vaccinations, he used to call them idiots, things like that. And now Andrei Kurayev is back on the scene as a deacon, apparently. So do we say thank you to Patriarch Bartholomew? I'm not sure. It's quite a confusing motion.
No, Andrei Kurayev, I remember some of his coal posts from early on in the days of the special military operation and some of these other things. Speaking of Ukraine, before we finally move away from there and start to wrap things up, everyone pray for the repose of Russell Bentley. He was known as Texas. He was the Texas guy. He was a little pro-communist, but he was, a member of the Orthodox Church in the Donbass. He was a strong warrior for the Donbass, I think since 2015, 2016. He was from Marble Falls, Texas, not far from where I'm at, and the rumor is he passed away in one of these airstrikes. I don't know if Dimitri, do you have any updates on that real quick before I talk about some other stuff?
No, really, the only update was one of the versions of his deaths, which seems rather heroic, was him and his wife. They visited a particular district of Donbass, which was under heavy risk of being sort of shelled by Ukrainians at the time in early April, I believe. So he was in this district of Donbass, Donetsk city in particular, and he was in a building with his wife. They were filling out some paperwork, just getting some business done. Suddenly there was a shelling on the street, like the entire marketplace, the street was shelled. There were victims outside, people bleeding. He went outside to actually help some of the people, and then the second volley hit. And he was almost completely, apparently his body was unidentified. You couldn't even find him. The second volley completely destroyed the area. So If this is how he passed away, heroically assisting, loving his neighbor, then this man who was only Orthodox for a few years, you know, has really shown that Christ's love could actually reach your heart and you can be transfigured as a human. You can reach these levels of, potential, I wouldn't say sainthood, but you can reach these levels which Christ has called us to reach to early on in even in your spiritual journey. I think it's an example for all of us that no matter where you come from, Europe, Africa, America, Asia, you can always be the most Christian person in particular situations, even when there's a risk to your own life, seeking to save these people on the street bleeding out. If this is really how he passed, in any case, we should pray for him because, again, as an Orthodox Christian, he has reposed recently and he did come to the church. So that's, I think, a blessing. And providentially, God has, sort of pushed him in this direction. So very sad that another fellow American who was pro-Russian in his views has passed away.
Oh, no, it's very sad. He had become a real member of the community and everything there, and he was in many ways a journalist. He had a lot of videos that were breaking news at the beginning of the SMO as he was with the Donetsk and Luhansk, people's militias and all of these sorts of things that he had been fighting with from the beginning. So I'm forgetting, I don't know maybe his baptismal name, but pray for Russell. I'm sure the Lord will know your intention. And then, of course, before we finish things out here, we would be remiss not to discuss the Mari Emmanuel stabbing in Australia. Many of you are probably already familiar with the well-known Nestorian bishop. He's actually schismatic even within the Nestorian Church of the East Communion. He's down in Australia. He preaches against the Great Reset and all of these sorts of things. Dimitri, what is the situation? What happened to this character, this very colorful character down under?
Yeah, so the TikTok star, Bishop of the Nestorian Church of the East, probably in schism within his own community, as you've stated, but still holding that rank of high clergyman. He was attacked in his own church during the evening service. I believe they had their own version of Vespers or Matins. There weren't that many people at his church at the time. This happened in one of Western Sydney suburbs, which have a lot of different diasporas around areas. And one of those diasporas, of course, was belonging to the Christian community of Assyrians who previously immigrated into the area after all the Middle Eastern wars, which, that's a big subject of migration from the Middle East, especially that of Christian refugees from Lebanon, as a good example, after the Lebanese civil war of the 1980s and 90s, and even from the Balkans itself, which is why a lot of former Yugoslavian citizens live among us in the West. It's because of conflicts in those particular areas. But Marmar Emanuel was praying, actually not giving a sermon. He was saying a prayer because it was in Assyrian. It was all live streamed on camera in the church itself. And of course, a lot of people were used to watching these service live streams because during COVID, there were very strict restrictions in the state of New South Wales and Australia in general where people couldn't attend church. Marmari Emanuel, to his credit, was one of those bishops who actually spoke out against not just the vaccine, but also the closures of very many churches and against the abortion laws passed in New South Wales the year earlier before COVID broke out and a lot of other things. So he was actually quite strong on, I would say, conservative positions, despite the fact that he isn't a member of the Eastern Orthodox Communion. I would say his conservatism is undeniable. And yet, suddenly during this evening service, he is attacked by an assailant, it turns out this man was under 18, so essentially a young boy. I suppose he was a Muslim because he was yelling Allah Akbar, and he struck the bishop, walked up to the essentially the Yamvon in the church and began striking the bishop with a knife. Now, the miracle actually that took place essentially during the stabbing is that the knife, which it appeared to be a flick knife of sorts, didn't actually come out of its sheath and in fact cut the assailant's fingers because it just wasn't, flicking out properly. And in fact, a lot of the five strikes which he dealt to the bishops, I believe only two of them, in fact, ended up hurting Marmari Emanuel. And so Marmari Emanuel's already, I believe, out of hospital. Yes, he has some stitches and they did check his health, things like that. He's an elderly man, despite being so energetic and outspoken on TikTok and YouTube and other platforms, but he's out of the hospital now. So the Assyrian community reacted very boldly to the stabbing. They instantly, caught the assailant. There was an alleged cutting off of the fingers. And this is not, we spoke about the cutting off of ears a few weeks ago. The fingers of the assailant were apparently cut off by some of the members of the Assyrian community who held the assailant down, and he was stabbing people as well. There was about 3 or 4 other people who were slashed at by this Islamic extremist, and a lot of people on TikTok and Twitter, on X, instantly began accusing him. They're like, this is a Mossad agent because Marmari Emanuel is very pro-Palestine. This must be an Israeli. It's like Islamic extremism is still a real factor. We just have to like not deny it, Conrad. I think that's the reality of the matter. And Marmari Emanuel did speak out against Islam on a few occasions, right? Especially from like an even Nestorian Church of the East position, but still, in a general Christian sense, Islam is not theologically compatible at all with any Christian denomination. I would say even the most ecumenist one. So, what could have essentially inspired this Islamic assailant, this neo assassin type character? We're not too sure, but does he even need a motive? Because again, Islam and the idea of jihad and the Sharia law type beliefs that emerged out of Arabia in the 600s, it was quite a violent type of religion, at least back then. Not in its modern form in a lot of communities where Muslims are quite peaceful, especially in Russia, but in its original iteration, Islam does appear like this the religion that doesn't really deny violence as a means to an end.
The real lesson from this story ultimately is Australia is cooked, specifically, the non-American Anglosphere countries, Canada, Australia, the UK. It's just over. The great replacement is in full effect. I mean, Canada takes half the amount of immigrants as the US despite having less than 10% of the population. So it's just over for them. You may end up like South Africa in a few years in some of these places, but I mean, just the whole situation. I mean, you've got crazy Muslims, you've got Assyrian Nestorians. It's like, this is Australia? Like, where are the Australians, involved in all of this? But obviously, it's a tragedy to see what happened to that community with, the fact that I guess Muslims and young people are watching Rumble streams and hearing people speak against Islam and then acting violent. That shows why that, look, obviously, I agree in a broad kind of focusing of the energy from Muslims and Christians on the problem of Zionism for Muslims, in the Middle East and for Americans and, Westerners, Jewish control of their country, Zionist control of their country. But a byproduct of that Zionist control is these multicultural issues, this mass migration. So Islamic violence is in many ways a byproduct of Jewish power. So because these Muslims recognize the problem and we agree on the problem doesn't mean that, the problem of Islam and how it relates to Jewish control, that the Islam isn't a real problem. You know what I mean? Like they are the foot soldiers of this violence in many ways that is imposed on us by this system of, people and Zionists in control that, see no country as having any kind of ethnic basis and wanting everybody to be a world citizen. And that's how you get unfortunate clashes like this, where Christian leaders are caught in the multicultural crossfire.
Yeah, and this is one of the many stories. We've seen churches raided during services in Ukraine before. In Palestine, these bombings take place, without viewing any consequence. We've seen bombings of Syria throughout the last 10 years, right, by ISIS, by, the Israeli Air Force. Again, this indiscriminate abuse of Christianity has taken place in the Middle East since, for the last 1500 years easily. And I would say, a word of sort of condolences to the Assyrian community for suffering this attack, but these people are used to it. I've had Coptic friends who I've spoken to who come from Oriental families, refugees from the Egypt, who have had grandfathers who have been beheaded by Islamic extremists and great grandfathers who are martyred in their own respective religions and cases in countries like Egypt and Ethiopia. So these things are very common. Christianity has been persecuted. I mean every denomination of Christianity has been persecuted in the Middle East. So it doesn't surprise me that the conflicts, and you mentioned, you were correct, Conrad, these immigrant conflicts which take place in the homelands, for example, between Serbians, Albanians, and, for example, Serbians and Bosnians, sometimes, and even Assyrians, of course, and say Iraqi Muslims, they're transferred onto the mainland into these Western countries to which they migrate and to which they come as refugees. And this is just the reality of the disturbances which take place. This is why the idea of Israel as this major point of disturbance is essentially this muddying of the water in the Middle East, destruction of peace. Peace really cannot be achieved when there's one power that flies its planes north, south, east, and west, and bombs any target that it deems sort of as a challenge to its supremacy. And so this particular existence of this entity, which is Israel, has been at the forefront and a catalyst for many of these conflicts, which essentially spill out, and eventually we have events such as this where Christian leaders are hurt by Islam. But I think you were correct by stating that these attacks most likely will continue because mass migration continues to be an issue, and it doesn't seem like any of the local politicians are moving to resolve them, unfortunately.
But in some more positive news stateside, we have Metropolitan Saba. He gave a series of talks, two talks on the Antiochian Archdiocese YouTube channel, and he talked about the future of monasticism, and he talked about a future women's monastery on the grounds of the Antiochian village in Pennsylvania, as well as another future monastery outside of Memphis, Tennessee. So the progress is being made to catch the Antiochian Archdiocese up with the American Orthodox monastic tradition. That's all very encouraging to see. And in America, unfortunately, some other unfortunate news. We had another self-immolation with this crazy, I guess, liberal guy in front of the Manhattan courthouse where Trump was there for jury selection for his trial there under AG Alvin Bragg, who's waging major lawfare against him to keep him off the campaign trail. But this guy, I guess, is some Occupy Wall Street liberal guy that thinks that cryptocurrency and Trump and Biden are working together to do a fascist coup on the American people. Really just kind of low IQ, lefty conspiracy stuff. He was almost maybe getting at some of the Trump antichrist stuff, but he wasn't even getting there. He hadn't even gone down all sorts of rabbit holes. So bizarre reason to self-immolate. And I saw his body afterwards. It doesn't look like if Aaron Bushnell didn't make it, I don't know if this guy's going to make it. It looked pretty brutal. And if he does make it, he'll be, you know, disfigured for life. So I guess pray for him. I can't remember his name. I think it was Ray or no, Alex, I think, or something like that. Or Mark. I don't know. I'm forgetting. But don't self-immolate. It's not a good idea to light yourself on fire. I think for these two American immolations is enough for a long time. I think we can pump the brakes on this, but I fear this may become a millennial trend. America really does need orthodoxy and spiritual revival because this sort of thing is proving that people are hollowed out for meaning. You know what I mean? People don't have meaning. People feel like they're going to die for nothing. So they might as well take their lives out in this dramatic way for something that they feel matters because in their minds, odds are they're just going to die in some hospital having lived for nothing, and they're pretty unsure, if not doubtful, about anything coming afterwards. So they have this sort of need to make their mark and make a difference now. And I think we may see more and more people go in this unfortunate direction, even if it isn't lighting themselves on fire. So be sure to pray for America, pray for the world as we see World War III unfolding. Obviously, we're going to continue watching the situation in the Caucasus and Israel. World War III, in that same way, the front in the Levant in the Middle East is really spreading to kind of encompass the Caucasus and the rest of these regions towards really becoming a visible World War III. And like Father Peter talked about on his InfoWars interview, which we're going to link below, the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the Middle East conflicts are going to brew. And then what's the meeting point between, Europe and the Middle East? Well, it's Turkey. And so when World War III really, really explodes, to the point where it's going to be unprecedented in world history, that's going to be when Turkey gets involved and, they're going to bring in Greece and they're going to close the Bosphorus Straits and perhaps they'll have done already a bunch of things in the Caucasus and will be moving in Iraq and Syria. And then, of course, like a snap of a finger, Russia will overnight, turn on them and not a city in Turkey will not be bombarded. That's what the prophecies say, right? So, Dimitri, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the broader World War III situation, and then we can wrap this thing up.
I think I was under the delusional sort of thinking that perhaps Iran's failure to cause any real strategic damage on Israel would kind of circumvent a reaction. But nevertheless, as we mentioned before, the demons of bloodshed, the demons of vengeance, they always hold supremacy in the hearts of those who reject God. And this is what we see in the case of the Zionists, as well as the Talmudic rabbis who, of course, are orchestrating this conflict in the Middle East quite heavily. And of course, they're fighting against Shia mullahs who are no better off, and they do not have the grace of Christianity. They don't have the grace of the church. So the level of people who are misguided, unfortunately, in the Middle East, the quantity of folks is very high. So in fact, the hope is that perhaps by some miracle, maybe conflict could be circumvented. But we can't really hope for miracles in terms of be in this weird fantasy land. All we can do is pray and let God's will be done. Perhaps war is God's will in this particular case in order to bring these people to their senses, right? And by these people, I mean the ones running Israel who are killing tens of thousands of innocents right now. Even war hasn't even been announced. This is Israel's own little special military operation against Hamas, and yet we see many innocents dying. Very concerning indeed. And I guess the last sort of bit of news was there was a recent scandal in Serbia, which I think if there are any Serbian brothers and sisters listening, if you can maybe get back to us in the comment section, just write your thoughts. If you were listening to Patriarch Porphyrios of Belgrade reading out the anathemas during the Triumph of Orthodoxy service, he was actually reading them in modern Serbian, not in Church Slavonic or in the Church Slavonic iteration of Serbian, which was the first time in Serbian history that, in fact, actually the first time in 100 years plus that the anathemas were read out by a Serbian patriarch. That's number one. And two, he read the new translation of them in a sort of vernacular version. And unfortunately, there was a lot of backlash. I read that on the Serbian, I guess, or really the Serbian hardcore right wing Orthodox websites. A lot of people were upset because they were saying the translation is really bad. The anathemas actually sound as if you're anathematizing the things which are good. In fact, the anathemas sound really bad in modern Serbian, and this is, I think, a big question of, modern vernacular translations in general, and if a church service could even be translated into modern Serbian or even modern Russian in some of these Orthodox countries. So that's just a query for this week. If anybody is Serbian, listen back to those anathema readings during the Triumph of Orthodoxy by Patriarch Porphyrios and give us your thoughts, what you think about that, because nevertheless, Patriarch Porphyrios had a really good he's a really good patriarch, in fact, probably a lot better than his predecessor, I would say, in terms of how he conducted himself and the schism resolution, things like that. But this was a good example of, well, where false translations and mistranslation can probably get you to, where, even prayers can sound a little bit strange and certain hymns and readings can be a bit confusing for the locals. So I know there was a lot of outrage in the Serbian circles, and Russian hierarchs and priests such as Father George Maximov had to comment on it. But yeah, it would be interesting to hear the opinion of our Serbian audience if you guys have listened to those anathema readings from this year.
No, we like Patriarch Porphyrios, but he did wish a good Eid Mubarak to Muslims on Ramadan. So, maybe less of that and more of some other things regarding, pro Kosovo, pro Srpska and Dodik. We like to see when he does that, and he's pretty strong on Serbian sovereignty. But thank you so much for listening, everybody. Be sure to follow us, worldwarnow.co. We've got a lot of articles this week. Be sure to check out Dimitri's Ritual Regicide article, as well as Chapter 2 of the Nikolaus Kozlov Ritual War article series. We're going to have all of those linked below, and we've got some big Ether hours coming up, so get behind that paywall and support us, worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com. Be sure to follow us on Twitter, worldwarnow_, that's X. I guess these days, follow me there at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. Follow us on Telegram at World War Now Telly. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Like the videos, comment. It really helps us out to share that around. It helps to like the video on Substack and on YouTube, even if one of them is your primary listening platform. Be sure to follow the World War Now Clips channel at WWN Clips on X and Twitter. I believe there's a TikTok account that should be up, and there's also a YouTube channel at WWN Clips. I believe we're on Rumble as well, and now we're available also wherever podcasts are available. So Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all sorts of other places. You can find all of those links in the RSS feed on the Substack, and I believe it's searchable on Apple Podcasts and Spotify as well. So thank you all so much for listening. Again, check the links below for all the premium content and become a premium subscriber if you want to support these weekly shows and get all of that content that we love to make and produce for everybody. Maybe we'll make some of those old ones free for everybody. Who knows? Comment below if you want us to do that. But thank you all so much for listening, and God bless. Dimitri, I'll let you send everybody off.
Yeah, thank you guys for listening. It was a really good episode. I think continuation, we're still here. The war has not broken out into a hot form yet. So thoughts and prayers of all those involved, all those stuck in the conflict zones. And thank you guys for your support. Our support group is growing quite heavily. We are working on the Discord for you so the community can grow, and there's a place where we can all share ideas, and it's not just me and Conrad speaking to you guys. It can be a two-way conversation, which if you guys have any questions, I always receive Substack messages, which I will be responding to. That's probably another good place to kind of get connected. But when the Discord does go up, I think moving forward, there could even be joint projects, joint papers, which we can kind of publish together, and different research groups, which we can actually form to kind of move this big World War Now type family forward, I think. And in fact, we do need an avenue as Christians to move, sort of move this news and geopolitical content in the right direction, especially with so many fake news platforms available to us. So thank you for your support, and we are working on bettering the experience for you.